Thank Annette from SCB for giving me a nice platform to begin. You did hear her say that from her point of view, green bonds should have the same return as any other bond. I, as an issuer, have a different perspective on that, and I want to talk to you about that a little bit later. I'm very sensitive that I'm the one holding you back from a wine tasting, so I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. But I think it's important, and we're actually very honored to have the last slot of a conference such as this. You've spent all day learning new techniques, new way of looking at things, and we're here to provide an avenue of potentially expressing those views through some of the structured issuance that we've done. And also it gives me a chance to talk to you about our green bonds and how we've developed that in the market and what the next stage of that is, and be delighted to answer any questions. The presentation is in a couple of different stages. First of all, it's always nice to start with a quick refresher on who the World Bank is. We'll go through our funding, move straight into the green bond, and then we can talk about the structured bond issuance program. To begin, World Bank is nothing but a cooperative bank. We're owned by 189 countries now, each with their own little percentages of capital, ranging from the US, which is the largest with 17%, all the way down to tiny little Pacific island nations with less than a tenth of a percent. We are central in the developmental financing section of the world. But essentially, this is the one of two organizations created right after World War II. The first was IMF, which essentially does the same thing that it was originally mandated to do, provides very large loans for emergency situations such as balance of payment problems. The second institution was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is one hell of a mouthful. And I'm glad somebody came with the nickname World Bank, because that's what stuck. But our job was to lend longer term to develop countries or economies to a point that maybe they didn't need emergency funding. That role began obviously with reconstruction of Europe, and our first loan was to France. And that's developed now to lending to the middle-income countries around the world. The World Bank Group actually has 5 different organizations. You may have heard of a couple of these. 2 of them, and by the way, these organizations are completely separate. There's no cross-support of any kind at all. The only thing we share in common is actually the president, who is the president of each of these organizations. IBRD, or otherwise called the World Bank in the markets, lends to sovereigns only. That's our job, is to develop the sectors in a sovereign level. The IFC's job is to develop the private sector in those same countries. So they'll lend or participate in equity participations of companies, banks in these emerging markets. The middle one, IDA, International Development Association, for the moment has not issued any bonds in the capital markets. They lend to very poor countries, ones that really can't afford commercially based loans, and they are funded through grants, mainly through their shareholders. There's a lot of talk now to expand their role, and they may at one point issue bonds, but they'll have to introduce a new loan product, which will obviously be able to pay back that leverage in the market. Well, we'll see about that. At the moment, there are IBRD bonds and there are IFC bonds. This is a very macro look at our lending book. As you can see, it's very diversified globally and by sector. The environment sector, which is where green bonds will be linked, and I'll explain that later, crosses a lot of these different sectors because there are green or environmentally friendly components to each of these areas. And those, as I'll describe later, will be eligible to be used as lending for the green bonds that we issue. All loans, which is one of the key fundamentals why we're still AAA, we have an exceptional loan quality, funny enough, even though we're lending to the poor countries. Part of it is because the loans that we do is after a very long process of partnership with each of the countries, identifying things they want to do to improve their economies. And it's very involved on both sides. And so we go through this process, which I'll bring up later, because we integrate this process with our green bond selection program. And it starts with identifying the projects that might be necessary. We have an enormous amount of technical expertise at the bank, which is one of the best value-added services that we provide our countries to help them in any of these sectors that we've talked about before. We'll help them assess, appraise these, and then we'll go through negotiations, get the loan approved. And then after the project has been finished, whatever that might be, we'll go back and evaluate its impact on what the original goals for that loan was meant, and see if we can learn for the future. AAA is really the first thing that people highlight as why invest with the World Bank. I would add to that the reputation that we have in the markets for having more liquid, better performing transactions is also equally important, especially for a structured bond investor. We have liquidity facilities that we buy back bonds to make sure that investors have some kind of liquidity for even the most highly structured bonds that we issue. We have a dedicated group of people, in fact, who will help MTN desks, banks, and even investors structure bonds that suit their criteria. I don't think you'll find that under one roof in any other organization. And we also try to offer the maximum number of different products to extend and to, in fact, enhance some of the sectors of that market. Because of the nature of our funding and our lending, we sort of always been on the sustainable ESG areas of the market. And even before we created the green bond, we were already trying to communicate the use of proceeds, because people, especially in the market today, are beginning to care more about what that dollar does after being invested and what it's being used for. And that's the whole premise of the growth in the ESG market. So we've done a lot of transactions prior to the green bond that had a very heavy component of communications to educate. That's the only way we have to be able to educate to investors what's happening on the loan side. From the funding point of view, we are much larger than we used to. As you see, right after the financial crisis began, much of the countries that we lend to saw diminished access to the markets themselves. And so they returned not just to us, but all the other supranationals, such as the EIB, IEDB, the Asian Development Bank. And so we've all grown in response to that. Currency mix, another area where we need to diversify as much as possible, is the number of currencies we issue. We try to target 20, 25 per year, and we're issuing bonds in as many as possible. Typically, for a year of $60 billion of issuance, we'll issue between 350 and 450 separate bond transactions. Most of it is in reverse inquiry coming on a daily basis. This is showing the types of bonds that we issue. The benchmarks is the bottom blue. Those are plain vanilla bonds that you can expect to see from any large issuer. The purple are the private placements, which often are very interesting to investors to be able to exactly choose the timing, maturity, coupon structure of a bond and buy it all by itself or create a club deal of some kind. But the yellow part is more interesting to possibly the group today. That's an area, like I said before, we have dedicated people helping ensure that we issue a maximum number of these transactions. And that requires understanding the markets, keeping up with the latest technology, but also an attitude towards making sure that the reputation we have with investors is good and it stays that way, because we keep that repeat buying coming for us. 20% of the funding program is structured. I mentioned before, any bond that we issue, we will buy back. So regardless of market conditions or whatever, if the street is giving you bad liquidity, the issuer, in the case of the World Bank, will provide a bid. And the way we do that is simply by calculating at that point in time what is our cost of funds to replace that bond. So imagine that you had bought a 5-year and it's got 2 years left to maturity. The market at that particular point is really bad. Dealers are not bidding anything. We will put a price on where we could issue a 2-year bond, and we'll buy that bond from you on an asset swap basis through any MTN or dealer. That is, we have found to be quite successful program. We buy back between $2 to $3 billion of bonds every year, and it offers that liquidity to investors, which in structured product is especially important. This is just some of the types of transactions we've done. We've used STOXX indices before. Happily, we look to do that in the future as well. But we're open to almost anything. We are, in the end, part of our financial management is we can't take currency or interest rate risk on our balance sheet. So whatever we're issuing, we're immediately swapping to dollar floating in the background. Nothing for you to. So whatever structure we come up with, we just need to be able to put into our systems and be able to value it and be able to swap it. And once that's set up, we're pretty much open to anything. We're very careful with principal protection. We understand how some of these bonds can later in secondary market end up in the wrong hands, and having a principal at risk is risky for our reputation. So we tend to stay away from those, but we do those after placing protection things in there. Sometimes we'll put the minimum denomination extremely high to make sure that retail later on doesn't get a hold of it, or something we will work out with the initial buyers to make sure that that reputational component is addressed. So green bonds, as Annette described, the story is really simple. In 2007, SCB came to us and they said, we have a few Swedish pension funds who would love to buy the World Bank, but you're too expensive. However, they've told us, if you were to issue a bond which the proceeds are exclusively into the environment or something green, then they would buy you at these levels. And so we went and studied that, and we found that a couple of things in the market had developed and it was moving in the right direction. EIB had done a quote-unquote green bond of their own. It was a structured bond. It wasn't very well received in the market. There was a lot of bells and whistles, but they did have that link where they had proceeds going earmarked to only a portion of their lending. So we took that technology, and with the help of SCB, we added things such as transparency. We listed exactly up ahead of time what projects would be eligible for these green bonds so that it made it clear to investors what the money was going to be used for. We made commitments on after investor reporting of what was done, what kind of loans were. We had the second party opinion, which has been crucial in the growth of the green bond market now, whereas we assigned an outside party to look at our methodologies of how we were going to make that allocation and give us an opinion that was a good thing to do. And then from there on, we issued the first bond in 2008, which was a Swedish kroner deal. Since then, we've issued over $9 billion of green bonds in various different markets, various different currencies. We've done them in plain vanilla. Lately, we've been focusing on structured bonds. We understand that the structured note product here in Europe particularly, but also in the US, is growing re-energized and now wanting the ESG green component to it. And for us, it made it a really easy decision. We provide the green proceeds. The indices are also green in their own way for different ways. And then also there's usually a component of vigilance on the type of companies that are part of that index, so that it's got in several different ways. It comes to become more green than just from a one-dimensional point of view. This is a page here on what our projects that we commit to fund the green bonds with. And again, they're listed ahead of time, and they're just a small portion of our lending. There are many other things that we do that are in the fringes of what we consider environmentally friendly, but because they have maybe been contentious at some point, for example, nuclear, we didn't include it in here just so that there wouldn't be no debate. So in other words, this is the super green of what we lend. Both mitigation and adaptation is covered in our green lending. Obviously, we concentrate a lot on adaptation. Since the poor, it's hard to do to give them the technology that will mitigate a lot of things, but they do need to adapt to the realities of what's happened already in the forestations, the relocations that they're going through. So we spend a lot of time on adaptation, but we do understand that mitigation is also very important, particularly on the investor side. So we do that too as well. And again, remember the project cycle that we had before. We overlaid that project cycle with the green bond selection. So we select the projects from the projects that we have. We have the team in our environment group who will use that criteria that we set up at the beginning, and through every single one of our loans, just check off the ones that are eligible for the green bonds, and those are the ones that we can fund with the green bond. Lately, we've spent a lot of time on impact reporting. Many of the investors, particularly some of the ones that are involved in our large benchmark transactions, have wanted from the community a way to verify that the impact of buying these bonds is actually making a difference. And as you can understand, that is a very complicated subject. But the World Bank, as the EIB and several other supranationals got together last year and have begun works towards standardization of impact reporting. We've done so now in the green area, in the carbon area, and we're trying to do that across the entire balance sheet through all of the ESG sectors, which is a ambitious effort, but we understand that transparency and that need from investors to be able to say, I bought this bond and it did this afterwards, especially for your own clients, is very necessary. So that's been work that's been going on quite heavily, and it's involved some of the very largest fund managers in the world to give their perspective as well. This is just a couple of slides that go more into detail of places you can get information from the individual project documentation. Our website provides you information on the loans that we funded so far. We also have this presentation and others that go into detail summarizing the type of loans that we do. And then finally, the first and latest impact report is on the website as well. Another one will be coming out soon. Earlier, it was mentioned that there was significant growth in the green bond market, and indeed there has been. And as you can see, the supranationals and the sovereign sector sort of led the market, which is usual. You see market developments beginning usually with the AAAs, but quickly the corporate sector and the financial sector took over. And that's really where the essence of the green market kind of always needed to be, and we're very glad to see that that's actually happened. Still, it is important for the AAA sector to continue to be out there because we can be developing the market in other ways. We're doing so now with the transparency of the impact reports. We're doing so as well with the development of the structured market in green bonds. And so it's not a market we're going to be disappearing from anytime soon. Equity-linked bonds. Again, many different structures, but just to give you an idea of what we've been doing lately, it's simply maybe just a zero coupon bond with in let's say in a certain currency, and we've taken those coupons that we normally would pay, and instead of paying the coupons, we buy the call options on the index, and then pay that performance to the investor. Usually that performance is the upside performance, again for the principal protection component. But again, if there's need to put a little bit of downside risk in there to enhance the performance, we can look at those, but we'd prefer those to be for institutional investors. We've done a few of these across Europe and in the US last year. It's quite successful, the types of placements that we're getting. This is just an illustration of some of the plain vanilla ones that we've done in the past. Standard fixed rate coupons usually, but we find that the distribution of the bonds is value added to us. It's a very different sector of the market that buys these bonds when we issue them, and that's good because sometimes that's our entry point into these investors, and they end up buying the regular bonds afterwards. This is when we did in euros. One interesting thing about these bonds, usually investors are very private about what they buy and what they don't buy. When they buy green bonds from us, they want to be the first ones on the press release. And in fact, one of our first dollar bonds was done exclusively for the state of California, and the treasurer beat us with his own press release out before we can get ours out. So there's a lot of potential in this market, and we're happy to have been an integral part of it. And we have lots of company, and there's a dedicated effort from our community to do so. I'm glad to have been able to speak to you. I didn't take the poll, but out of you, how many are money managers or investors of some kind in structured bond products? And those that are involved on the intermediaries, the MTN desks and things like that? Okay, good. We engage with all the different players in the market, so feel free to give us a call. Again, we have a dedicated focus on this. And happy to answer your questions either on the credit, World Bank, or structuring these transactions. At this point, if there's any questions at all, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, George, for a very interesting presentation.